Well, good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. And once again, I'm delighted to welcome our viewers from across the globe. This evening, our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest, David Wurtzel. I'll introduce David to you in just a moment after some brief housekeeping. Please do ask questions. Do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. As ever, we will do our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. Let me also draw your attention to the chat facility. You can use this to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. Finally, we are recording this event and it will appear on our website at milim.org.uk in the next few days. There you will find recordings of other past events and details of our forthcoming program for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest this evening, David Wurtzel was born in Hollywood to a family that had worked in the movie industry since 1917. After studying law at Cambridge, he practiced at the English bar. He was elected a bencher of Mid-Temple in 2001, and for several years was consultant editor of Counsel, the bar's own magazine. This evening, we're discussing his book, The Chosen City, Hollywood in the 1930s. This is actually David's second novel. He joins us from Battersea in London. David, a warm Milim welcome to you. Nice to have you with us.
Jonathan, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Now, for the benefit of those who haven't read this book, and it really is an enchanting read, briefly, what's it about?
Well, the narrator and hero, I would say, is Bobby Steingrove, who's the outsider member of a family that owns a motion picture studio in the 1930s. I say the outsider because the studio is run by owned, I should say, by his Uncle Stanley. Three of his uncles work there in one capacity or another, but Bobby's father doesn't, and that makes him, as I say, a bit of the outsider in the family. And he escapes from that by rather unexpectedly being accepted at Yale, despite the quota of the early 30s, and where he equally unexpectedly, as far as he's concerned, is taken up by a rather enchanting group of friends who find quite a lot entertaining and attractive about him. But things don't quite work out, and he winds up back in Hollywood, where through a series of events begins to be the writer of a movie based on a novel, which is actually, he's rather afraid, based on him, and then through an accident, the director. And although it's quite a good film, things again don't entirely work out, and it ends with him having to think about his future and what he's going to do next.
So was there something specific that made you want to write this novel?
Well, I had got to the point, and this is now a while ago, rather unusually, you mentioned the first novel called Thomas Lister, which was my Cambridge novel, which was published by a small firm called Brilliance Books, which is like a pop-up firm. In the old days, when life was much easier, I think, in the publishing industry, there was a person Friday in the office called Jeanette Winterson, who would put the Brilliance titles in a van and take them around and go to Hatchard's and W.A. Smith, and they go up on the shelves. But unfortunately, Brilliance sort of disappeared just as they were about to publish my second novel. So I found an agent. The agent liked the book, but he said it's the kind of book that publishers dither over and then reject. So what was I going to do next? And it suddenly occurred to me that what I really ought to do is to start to write a Hollywood family saga, because as you said, I was actually born in Hollywood. All Jewish children at the time were born in Caesars of Lebanon Hospital, which is absolutely in that part of Los Angeles, which is unquestionably Hollywood. It's no longer a hospital. It was taken over some years ago by the Church of Scientology, who painted it a rather terrible color blue. I said that I was reminded of this a few days ago. The Guardian had an article about the Scientologist, and the main photograph was the photograph of the hospital where I was born in the awful shade of blue. But that was only a coincidence that my family had indeed worked in Hollywood from 1917, when my great uncle Saul was sent out there by William Fox, who was his secretary, to supervise the production of films at the studio which Fox had just bought. That was the silent era. And as happened, it's quite a lot in Hollywood, the family gradually moved out. His brothers wanted jobs, and they got jobs and did rather well in them, including my grandfather. And then in turn, their sons, including my father, worked at Fox. And so it carried on. Because my father worked at the studio until I was the age of 12, when I needed a haircut, my mother would simply drive to the Fox lot where they all knew her at the gate, and I was taken to the barber shop. And there my hair was cut by Mr. Green, who was also a chess master in his spare time. When I needed to go to the dentist, I was taken to the 20th Century Fox lot because there was a dentist there who operated out of Shirley Temple's old bungalow. And this all seemed perfectly normal, and we would have meals in the commissary until, unfortunately, a movie called Cleopatra nearly bankrupted the place. So my father wound up the rest of his career working at CBS and latterly on some other television. So when I began to think about a Hollywood novel, I inevitably thought about my family and what they had done, and I could visualize what the Fox lot looked like, at least then, and that gave me a start. And so I began to put together a story about, as I say, a studio with 5 brothers. In the novel, Stanley owns the studio. It was very different from Saul, who was a producer. Stanley's in a much stronger position. So it took off from there. The Chosen City is several drafts along that beginning, but that's where it was, and it needed, I thought, an outsider, and so I created Bobby.
So obviously you say you were born in Hollywood, but by the sound of your accent, you've been here for quite some time.
Yes.
When did you just move, or did other members of the family move to?
Oh, no, you have to understand about California. California is the place you ultimately go to, and once you're there, there's no place left to go. And for many years when I was living here, friends of my parents would come and visit, and I'd see them. And the first thing they would say is, "When are you coming back to California?" Because it was inconceivable that one wouldn't. Well, what happened was that I went to a local school in Los Angeles, and then I went to Berkeley in the brave days of the 1960s, which meant that you made your way to campus through various anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. And by luck, I decided to do a junior year abroad, which in those days meant that you spent a year abroad at a foreign university. And I wound up at Birmingham University, where I made some very good friends. And some of them were a bit, I think you call them rather Oxbridge Monkey. They wore tweed jackets. We spent the afternoons having tea. When it got late enough, somebody opened up a sherry bottle, and then we strolled into dinner. And this to me seemed immensely civilized. And I went back to Berkeley, which was as tumultuous as ever. And I went back to my fraternity house, where we sat down to dinner at 5:30 and we finished at 6. I mean, it wasn't only that, but I decided that for a while I would be an academic. And so I did an MA at London University, but I fairly quickly decided I really wasn't going to be an academic. My mother had always wanted me to be a lawyer or a doctor, of course. So I thought I'd be a lawyer, and anyone could be a barrister in the sense that they were self-employed. So I didn't have to worry about work permits. And by miracle, I got into Cambridge, which changed everything, both the people I met and studying law. And if I could add, quite the most exciting, something that actually did connect to the States. When I was growing up, we had a program called College Bowl, which was a quiz program of 2 colleges. And because I like collecting obscure facts, I used to dream that one day I would grow up and go to college and I'd be on College Bowl. Well, as it happened, University Challenge bought the rights to College Bowl. That's how they started the program here. And when I was at Fitzwilliam College, we were asked to be on University Challenge. And I was on the team, and I was captain of the team, and the team won the seasonal championship. And it's something I think I'm still recovering from.
How incredible. Are there recordings of this? Does it survive?
Oh, well, this is the tragedy. Years later, this is now about 2002, they had a whole series one summer called University Challenge Reunited, in which they brought back the teams who'd won the championship to play off against each other, now everybody much older. And when we got there and had a wonderful reunion with the people in the team, they broke us the news that they had lost all the tapes from the early 1970s. So I have the tape of me on University Challenge Reunited, but not the tape of me answering obscure questions in 1973.
Now, one of the things you have in the book is Stanley lives in a very opulent house. He's building an even bigger house.
Yeah.
What sort of house did your Uncle Sol live in?
A house exactly like that. I never saw it. My parents knew it, and I knew my cousins very well, his children. What happened was Saul worked really under the thumb of Fox. Spent his time in, if I can backtrack a bit, Fox spent his time in New York and kept Saul on a very, very short leash. And some of the letters between them survive. And they were fairly brutal. If I can just quote a letter that Fox wrote to him, he said, "There was never a scene that I ever cut out of a picture that met with the director's approval. The only reason the Fox Film Corporation has made progress is because the power as to what will or will not remain in the film has been entirely left with me. I do not want any further controversy or correspondence on the matter." And although Saul didn't start the job with a facial tic, he ended it with a facial tic he had for the rest of his life, putting up with that. But Fox stretched himself and tried to buy MGM, and then the Depression came in, and he was eventually, this is a long story, paid off with $15 million. And Saul, who had been paid $200 a week, it was nothing, was given $500,000 as a thank you.
Which was a huge amount of money.
Huge money, 1930, 31, that was a lot of money. And he hired the most fashionable architect in Los Angeles, Wallace Neff, to build him a house. Neff could do period houses beautifully. He did Normandy Manoirs, he did whatever you wanted. And he built for Saul a mock-up of the Villa Giulia in Rome, in the hills of Bel Air, which were empty at the time. There are photographs of it. The 126 feet wide and 50 feet deep at its widest and deepest. And there he was, set up quite extraordinarily in that great house. and they lived in a very grand manner. I mean, I asked his daughter, Lillian, what it was like living in the house. And she very kindly, this was 7 years ago, just described that the interior, she described it as largely as Venetian, the interior. There were ceiling paintings. There was, I have some photographs which we can show in due course. They uh, uh, what happened was his wife Marion, a remarkable woman who came over to England. Came over to New York in the classic immigrant style. She had an elder sister who came first. Both she and my family both came from Galicia, which was then part of the Austrian Empire, is now in Poland, at the age of 16. And she met Saul when they were both living on the Lower East Side. And by the time this house is built, she could speak French and Spanish. She could speak accentless English. She became an artist and a woman of immense good taste. So they lived up to this great house. And in 1931, when the house was being built, with my grandfather, who had become head of construction, really in charge of the building, she went to Europe on a buying spree, and Lillian was there as well. And the result, as Lillian described it, the dining room, he said it wasn't a particular suite. She remembered these magnificent tablecloths, an 18-foot damask cloth with a parade of medieval knights and ladies. There was French glassware and Venetian champagne glasses and lots of English silver, including a Paul store tureen and a Georgian tray. And she had chosen this in New York and Paris and London and Italy. She remembered when they got to Venice, the people on Murano bought them tickets at La Fenice to the opera as all part of the marketing. And they dined mainly in inviting people from the studio. You didn't invite people from other studios for some reason. They're invited to dinner, and then you showed one of your host's movies in the projection room, and you always said nice things about your host's movie. And she described the menus as a shellfish or avocado cocktail, a broth, a roast of chicken. It wasn't grand catering, and a dessert of ice cream or chocolate mousse or souffle. And interesting, there was no wine cellar, by her recollection. They drank cocktails. She didn't recall anybody ever getting drunk, but they drank cocktails and liqueurs. So inevitably, when I started the novel, where's Stanley going to live? But in a house very much like that. And it begins with his favorite cousin, Elaine, who's his best friend in the world, Bobby's cousin, about to go to Europe with her mother on a buying spree.
Well, we'll come to this. We'll come back to this. I was interested to ask what I suppose what of note your family might have done in Hollywood. Would we know any of their work? Would we know any of the people that they worked with?
Oh, yes. Well, when things became difficult at the studio in the early 30s, and there wasn't very much money, Saul was given the assignment of making inexpensive movies, and that was the birth of what were called B movies. And it was through those, and it was part of the system, that they effectively groomed a lot of the future stars. I mean, Will Rogers, now probably forgotten, but was a big star in the 30s. Saul did some of his movies, and then he graduated on. Alice Faye was another one. And there was a little 4-year-old girl at the studio called Shirley Temple. And nobody wanted to make a movie with a little girl. but sold it, and it was called Bright Eyes, and he thought it needed a song, and that's why we have On the Good Ship Lollipop. And after that, she saved the movie, she saved the studio, and she became a star. And he discovered Rita Hayworth. By chance, he gave Marilyn Monroe her first part. He was asked to find a part for this totally unknown person they didn't want to give a screen test to, and he found a part for Marilyn Monroe. So that was his thing, is making Shirley Temple a star. My mother's war work, I always like to point out, is was signing Betty, because when she became engaged to my father, she needed a job, and your family, you were given a job in the studio, and her war work was signing Betty Grable's signature to the famous photograph that I always like to think won the war. But the one that everybody probably knows will recognize, though they didn't know that he was there, my cousin Paul, who became head of special effects as a young man, operated the wind machine under Marilyn Monroe's skirt in the 7-Year Itch. And that, I think, is probably our largest claim to fame.
There's some quite iconic moments there. It sounds
The
like
iconic moment.
yeah.
Any photograph, you every time you see anything to do with the movies, there's Marilyn Monroe with the skirt up, and we actually, I've seen it somewhere, a photograph of Paul with the wind machine. Somebody had the sense to take a photograph to prove that it really was him.
So absolutely fascinating and very, very interesting about your family. Maybe there should be a biography at some point of this of Sol and his wonderful work. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about your novel. So how do you turn all of this information into a structured novel which people will read and enjoy reading?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of the Hollywood things, and indeed some of the things that when Bobby's at Yale, are there really to add to the verisimilitude, because what I really want to do was to write a novel about somebody who I hope to make basically very talented and bright and charming. And what happened, it's really his struggle, first of all, to making it socially and then professionally, and the rest of it is the context and the background, and it's his story of how he gets on with people who he never expected to encounter. It's something which you might call the brideshead syndrome. Is the outsider being brought in where he didn't expect to be, and how he copes. And as I say, then things rather unexpectedly go wrong. And then I really want to get the excitement of how you made a movie. And so we have him starting out working in the studio as a laborer, which I did in my summer holidays when I was at Berkeley, and then writing it. And I have fairly strong views about drama that I've been sort of taught over the years. So Bobby's a bit of a Stanislavski before his time. And then how to direct and what your relationship is with the other actors. And it's very important, is his relationship with both the male star of this movie, and particularly his leading lady, who is discovered because of something he did quite unexpectedly. But it's the background, the Hollywood. I didn't write it. I didn't when I was writing the bit when he's at Yale, I didn't see it as a Yale novel the way Thomas Lister was a Cambridge novel. It was the story of the people with that, I hope, true background. And I'm delighted with friends who have read it and then say, oh, it all was rather unexpected. I didn't think that was going to happen.
There are twists and turns in it, and you don't always know where it's going. I think it's quite interesting. You mentioned the leading lady and the circumstances of her discovery, if you like, which are almost random. And what was it really like that somebody could just suddenly be propelled to stardom?
I think people there are a lot of people who came to Hollywood, you know, wishing to be discovered. And I think there had to be some trigger, I think. Uh, I mean, I just read um, of a film, and I can't quite remember which it was, which Alice Faye was going to be in, and she had appendicitis, um, and so she couldn't do it. And there was a sort of not quite an ingenue, but sort of starlet who was there, called Betty Grable, and so they gave her her part, and she became a star. Um, yes, I mean it did happen. I mean they worked up a lot of these things, as I say, sold through the B movies, and then you waited for your break. If it came, were you the right? You know, did you look right? Did you have the right personality? Did you have the quality on stage? Could you connect to the audience? Because people, don't forget, there are hundreds and hundreds of movies made in Hollywood every year in the 1930s. People went to the movies every week or twice a week. And so you really needed to connect to an audience, as some people did. I mean, one of the people who came through the family was Claire Trevor, who was both the on the books of my great uncle Harry, who was a very successful agent, as was the director John Ford, and was Saul's mistress for some years, and everybody stayed very good friends. And it was Harry who got her the part in Stagecoach, the famous John Ford Western, and in fact managed to get her the highest salary of $15,000 for the movie, much more than a young man called John Wayne, who was also in it. And it made them both stars, and it happened. But Laura, actually, the story of Laura, how Laura gets into it, is part of the book as well, and how she gets discovered.
So you've changed, you've made some sort of changes from the real world to the world of fiction. What I wondered is in terms of maybe Bobby or perhaps some of the other characters, whether any of it is autobiographical in any way, whether there's anything of you in any of these characters. Certainly what you've mentioned about wearing the tweed and you know certainly borne out in the book, but what about the sort of lived experience of Bobby?
Well, in some ways I rather wish. I mean, I think it's more wish fulfillment than autobiography. I've endowed him with certain things that I can't do. I'm a very weak swimmer. He's a brilliant swimmer. I mean, he's just a champion. I can't dance. He's a great dancer. I just invented the idea that he was taught by the choreographer at Steingrove Films how to dance. I certainly cannot claim to be a sexual athlete, but I've decided that he might as well be. So I've allowed him to do all these things. As I said, but I've done things. I mean, for example, I mentioned University Challenge. I've given him the ability to come up with obscure facts all the time. He's a bit smart alecky that way. So he can do that. And there were times, I mean, I use it's not a biography of my family because I didn't know Saul. I thought of Stanley as a mogul. And the idea that there's a starlet's room where he takes his pleasure, I think really comes from Zanuck. I think he had that, that I read somewhere. So I use that. I mean, at times, when I wasn't sure what somebody would say, I used an expression that was used in my family, and I thought, well, somebody uses that. When my mother occasionally, she was very frustrated with me, would mutter, rotten kid. So when Bobby's mother is upset with him, she says rotten kid. I thought, well, there it is, that'll ring true.
Now, you say you worked in the studio in your holidays, but you worked in the studio much later than the period of this book. I mean, clearly you weren't there 100 years ago. So how do you how do you account for that? Because presumably technology had evolved over the few decades between when you were there and the book is set. So how have you sort of worked backwards to understand what it would have been like at the time?
Partly reading the books about history of Hollywood. It's very much a function of the studio system, which I did understand because I grew up when there was still a studio system. It was the last days of it.
So the system hadn't changed, but the equipment maybe did.
Oh, the equipment did. Yes, I mean that was one thing I couldn't. I mean, I didn't do a technical history of what the cameras exactly would have been like. I imagined what they would be, and how the lighting would be, because I'd seen that. I'd seen a soundstage, so I knew how that was set up. And I knew what things looked like, so I could describe officers and the commissary and what it was like shooting out of doors and that sort of thing. But I knew the heart of it is that so much of this was a part of family, because Saul was there producing the B movies very, very successfully. My grandfather was head of construction. The younger brother, Sam, was working there as well. Harry was a very successful agent, and was able to place a lot of people at his brother's studio. And then their sons did it as well. As I said, my mother was given a job. Harry's daughter, Edith, married a journalist, United Press journalist, who was credited for having broken the news of the Spanish Civil War in 1936 when he was a correspondent in Madrid. But she eventually enticed him. That's a long story there. I could talk an hour about him. Back to Hollywood, and she had fallen desperately, very much in love with him, wanted to marry him. So how do you keep somebody in Hollywood? She goes to Uncle Saul and gets him a job as a screenwriter. And their friends were young writers at the time when he was first starting out. And I noticed one of them was somebody who had worked for Zanuck at Warner Brothers, who was married to a Warner Brothers daughter. Another one was the son of an executive at MGM. They were already into the second generation. The families working there and looking after each other. So I could understand. It wasn't difficult understanding how the system worked. That at the one hand, you were doing a job, and on the other hand, it was family. So the one of Lester, who was Edith's husband, when he was in despair, and things were going badly, his co-writer, really like a writing partner, we would say, was fired. But Lester wasn't fired because Lester was family. In the same way, when Bobby has his denouement with Stanley at the end of the novel, it's not just concern about what he's done in the film, which is going over budget. It's what he's done in the family, because the two things are now totally mixed up. The family and the studio together.
Now, one thing anybody reading the book is going to notice is the very detailed description of the interiors, not just the house of Bel Air, but also the properties in New York, which were also opulent, and the places that people are going and the things that people are seeing. It's all described in very vivid detail and really takes you back to the period in a convincing manner. Now, you've talked about this letter that this account you had from your cousin about the Bel Air house, but what about all the rest? How have you researched this? How have you managed to conjure up convincingly what America in the 1930s was like?
Well, partly by then I part of my spare time interest, you could say. I remember the Georgian group of the Furniture History Society, and now the Decorative Art Society. And I've been a pretty passionate tourist as well. So when it came to, for example, describing the interior of a Gilded Age mansion on Fifth Avenue, I had no difficulty with that at all, because I just knew exactly, I knew how the Vanderbilts furnished their houses. I've seen plenty of pictures of it. So that was that bit was very easy. And also what his friend Peter's house, which is done in a very classical federal style. I knew obviously what that looked like. So that was fairly easy. The internet helps rather a lot. When I want to know where you went to posh clothing shops in New Haven in 1931, you can Google it. And how much a car cost. I mean, those are just sort of facts that you can fill in. But I knew quite a lot about interiors and decoration and architecture at the time, so I was able to do that. That in a sense was the easiest bit. The difficult thing was remembering to do it. Because what I really enjoy is writing dialogue. And I had to stop occasionally and say to myself, well, I better describe where these people are and what it looks like, because that obviously is a very, very important function.
Just a reminder to audience that if you do have questions for David, do punch them into the Q&A in the 20 minutes or so we've got left. Now, we've spoken a lot about the characters and how your family influenced the characters. What about the events of the book? Were any of those influenced by actual things that happened to your family or within your family?
Well, I can, if I can I read just
Please do, yeah.
A small portion? It's at the very beginning of the book. At this stage, Bobby is has been accepted by Yale, and it's spring of 1931, and his cousin Elaine has invited him to the studio because they're showing a film. This was something which was very common. At the end of a movie, there'd be a showing of the movie. I had knew about this. And everybody involved in the movie would look at it and they could comment on it. Although obviously the producer and the director would be looking at the rushes as it went on, which is something that is mentioned in the book. And it's a movie called The Countess and the Cowboy, and it's starring a Russian actress who Stanley has brought over, which happened from time to time, even in the sound era. Famously, Sam Goldwyn bringing over Anna Sten, who everybody thought couldn't really speak English. And she plays a barmaid in the Old West, very bizarrely, and a Donald Marshall, who's the romantic lead for the studio in all his films, is the dude who goes out west. And so Bobby sits in the back because he has nothing to do with anything. He's just there for lunch and to see the movie. And he says, there are ridiculous subplots when some evil person from Europe turned up to, to claim back Sonia for reasons I could not follow. There was no chemistry between the stars. Sonia was frankly too old, and whatever voice lessons she had been given had not got rid of a very thick accent. It was hard to imagine any of her cowboy customers in the saloon taking her seriously, unless they were also Russian aristocrats who wound up for some reason in Montana. But the cowboys in this picture were tough Americans. Donald Marshall, that's the romantic hero, normally a romantic hero, was the last man to conquer the Old West. He could no more hold his own against Sonia than he could against the bad guys, who suddenly appeared and wanted to take the ranch away from him. Long before the end, I lost interest. I assumed that Sonia had been brought to Hollywood to make her a star. I doubted she would become one. Uncle Stanley must be feeling very disappointed. Elaine hated it too. I can't stand it, she whispered. It's awful, I agreed. She shook her head. When it was over, the lights came on, and the projection room, there was an uncomfortable silence. Everyone waited for Uncle Stanley. Sonia looked at him expectantly. Victor Hill, who's the director who's been brought over from England to direct this. smirked as if to say, "I got it right, didn't I?" Slowly, Uncle Stanley got up. "Time to go back to work," he declared. "Well, Mr. Steingrove?" Victor prompted him. I sat back and waited for it. Uncle Stanley paused. His face had an expression that I had never seen before. It looked like a combination of anger and betrayal. Suddenly, he looked directly at me. "Ask the kid," he asked. "I beg your pardon?" Victor gasped. "I said, ask the kid." Everyone turned around and looked at me. For a moment, I just stared back. What was going on? Did he really expect me to say something about the movie? I saw the look of incredulity on the faces of my uncles, as if to say, what does this have to do with the bookworm's son? That gave me courage. Bobby's father was a postman who is unable to work any longer and is living off Stanley's charity, which is why his uncles look down on both of them. And he spends all day reading books, which is why he's called the bookworm. I looked at Uncle Stanley. He was furious, that was obvious. He hated the movie as much as I had. It was his job, though, to pronounce the verdict. What was he doing? Then I realized that if he had liked the movie, he would have said so. If he disliked it, he would have said so. If it could be fixed somehow, he would have said so. What Uncle Stanley wanted now was some kind of vengeance, and I had been made the tool of that vengeance. I would love somehow to thank Uncle Stanley for having agreed to pay for my education, and this was the chance to do it. If I said the right thing, and if I didn't, if I made a fool of myself and of Uncle Stanley, what would it mean? More humiliation for my parents? Spending 4 years washing dishes in New Haven to pay for my own education? There was no escape. I paused, and then I said, "It stinks." "What?" Victor cried. "It stinks," I repeated. There, I thought. Now they could go and fix it, do whatever happened. But something far more momentous was about to happen. Uncle Stanley said, "You heard the kid. You're through." "Now, wait a minute," the director said. "I said you're through. Go back to England." He turned to Sonia. "Sorry, honey. I'll pay off your contract. You'll be better off in Berlin." And then Stanley's brother, who's Sonia's agent, protests. And that's when Stanley pulls himself up to his full height and says, "I can make any dame in the town a star if I want to," he shouted. He waited for someone to disagree. No one did. "Watch me." And he turned to his secretary. "Kay, where can I find the most girls in one place on this lot?" And she said, "In the typing pool." And he said, "We're going there." And that's where he discovers Laura Hampshire, who becomes the star. Now, where did the idea from this come from? Well, quite genuinely, in about 1930, Saul produced a movie not called The Countess and the Cowboy, but The Princess and the Plumber. I couldn't resist doing something similar. And they showed the movie at the studio at Western Avenue, where he was in charge. And sitting there was his son, my cousin Paul. I hasten to add that after my great-grandmother died, 3 of her sons called their sons, who were then born after she died, Paul, after her, which caused endless confusion because you had 3 Paul Wurtzels working at the studio. He turned to my cousin Paul, and who was only about 9 years old, and we don't know from this story, unfortunately, whether he was planted there or whether he was just being difficult. But when the director asked, "What do you think of the movie?" he turned to Paul and said, "Ask the kid." And Paul said, "It stinks." And he turned to the director and said, "You're through," just like in the novel. The director was Alexander Korda, and Korda did leave Hollywood, as Saul told him to do, and he came back to England and saved the British film industry. So indirectly, I would like to think that my cousin Paul, who I was very fond of, indirectly saved the British film industry by sending Korda back to Hollywood. So I couldn't resist using an incident like that, changed to make it fiction and to put Bobby into it. So
How
that's why I did
interesting,
it.
how fascinating. We have a question
Oh
from
yes.
Carol Gold. Carol is interested how long it took you to write the book and whether it was an exciting experience for you personally. And I would add to that that it's actually been something like 25 years between this and your previous book. So I'm assuming it didn't take you 25 years to write.
No, well, it's even longer.
Oh,
No, what happened was, I began to write it. I mean, I'll take this rather quickly. Because it's a long story. I started to write it for this nice agent who sent it round, and couldn't find any buyers. And one of the publishers took me to lunch and said, "I don't want to publish this book, but I want you to write a legal novel because you're a barrister." So I wrote a legal novel for her, and she tried to sell it and she didn't. And at that stage, I gave up completely for years. And I went back to a legal novel later and was helped by a mentor. And I said to her, well, if anybody's ever interested in this, I said, I have a Hollywood family saga sitting on my shelf and I could always rewrite that. And she said, do it now. So I took out the saga, which was much longer than Chosen City, and I reworked it. And it meant a huge amount to me to do it. It's gone through several drafts. I started out in the third person, and that didn't work. I started out having Bobby and Elaine as different narrators, and that didn't work. And I decided Bobby had to tell this story about himself and the family. And so that's how it became what it did. It meant a very great deal because I did think about uh, my family as I wrote it, and it I would sort of write a scene and then I would get stuck and I go away and then I think of how to end it and I go back, and I loved it. It's hard to say how long it took, but maybe it just found its time.
um,
And found a publisher.
interesting.
Much
You
support.
know you are a barrister.
Yes.
What can you share about finding your voice as a writer? Because there's a very different mindset. I would
Um,
imagine it's a very different
yeah.
mindset.
It's a different mindset, but it's also being about is something of a trap because whether you're on your feet, which I spent a lot of my time doing because I was spent most of my time in crime, so I spent a lot of my time on my feet talking to juries, or whether I was writing advices or anything in writing, you're covering all the bases all the time. You have to think of all the various possibilities and deal with it, and what might somebody say after you sat down, and how would you deal with it now while you're still on your feet. And it's also terribly linear, da 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 da, because it all has to work logically, and that actually is not a good beginning to writing a novel, because a novel isn't like that. A novel, you have to suddenly about thinking about foreshadowing,
Mm.
and characters and putting yourself in the place of other people. Um,
Did
you
you have any training of any kind? Did you study
yeah,
writing? It's just
yeah,
come to you
yeah.
naturally, as it were.
No, well, I don't know. I leave it to readers to decide whether or not it's natural.
Mm.
I did years ago. I took a sort of an acting class on a Saturday morning. A marvelous woman who sadly is no longer with us, and she taught me a very great deal about sort of truth in character.
Mm.
And I remember we would do exercises, and the worst thing she could say was, "I don't believe it." And that taught me rather a lot about dialogue, and I go to a huge amount of theatre and cinema, and one begins to think about it. I was very pleased by a nice review of the Jewish Chronicle that said they're wondering who might be in the movie. I need to find a movie producer first, and I haven't.
Well, I was going to ask you, has there been any interest in actually making a film
Um,
about the movie business?
Not yet, but I'm keeping
Not
my
yet.
fingers crossed. I hope there's a movie maker in the audience tonight, but otherwise, um, uh, some friends of mine have actually sent it to somebody who knows somebody who may know somebody, but who
Your
knows.
family no longer are in.
Sadly, nobody owns a studio in my
Oh
family.
dear.
I wish they did.
Tell
Um,
me, you mentioned the review in the Jewish
oh
Chronicle. I mean,
yes,
this is quite a Jewish book,
yes.
and I suppose how important do you think the Jewishness is to the story, and how important
Hmm.
is it to you personally as a writer?
It means a very great deal because um, it's the centrality of family.
Mm.
Um, uh, the I mean, I don't know whether it's peculiarly Jewish, um, because I've never grown up in a Christian family. But I know how important family was in my family. I mean, I grew up with all the Wurzels around me because there weren't that many of us. And if there was a wedding or a bar mitzvah, everybody was invited. So I had this sense of generations, and I adore genealogy anyway.
Mm.
Um, and it worked much. It works dramatically um, much better to have this, and I think this mixture of Jewishness and things. And it's very important to Bobby when he goes to Yale because he's not expected that he would fit in with anybody because he's Jewish. I mean, there are very few. The few Jews he meets at Yale are all brighter than he is, and they're not interested in him. And the fact that he's suddenly accepted by his Gentile friends who find something very attractive about him in three different ways, the three different young men he's friends with. Um, and I suppose that paralleled the fact that that living in England, my family's all in the States, and I don't live it in that sense Jewish life, although I belong to a synagogue and I go to services there. The It does mean it still means a vast amount to me, but when I think about Jewishness, I think about family. When I think about Passover, what I think about is my family when I was a child, sitting around, going through the Haggadah very slowly. The last time I actually went to a family Seder, they ran through it like an express train, and I thought, no, 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 no. This is you want to dwell on this. So it does mean a very deal, and it also means the loyalty, I think, between them. I have some pictures. I don't know if there are any of
Yes,
any
yes,
interest.
we can share
Um,
those.
just to
Um,
illustrate a few a few of these things. I can get them fairly quickly.
Here we go. I
Yes.
hope everybody can
Um,
see those.
can I,
So there's the first
that's
one.
where we start. That's my great-grandfather and his five sons, taken somewhere on the Lower East Side of New York in the late 1890s, all dressed up in Civil War uniforms, which is a bit silly because they came from Galicia. Though the sons were born in New York, each in a different address, which shows that they weren't very well off. So obviously that was from the dressing up box of the photographer. So that's where we start. Now transformed into holiday glamour. There's Saul with the glasses. There's Lester, who I mentioned, who is the journalist turned playwright. And there's two very glamorous stars. There's Cesar Romero on the left and Carmen Miranda without a banana headpiece. But looking, that's a star. You just look at her.
It's so interesting, isn't it, that if you were presented with that photograph and said pick the two stars, it's very, very obvious, isn't it?
Yes, yes. That was after they were about to go to South America on a tour. Lester was actually looking up to see Axis influence in South America in about 1941. The precursor of the CIA sent him. That's another story. Here's a bit of glamour. There's Harry, the agent, with Claire Trevor, all dressed up looking fabulous, and I presume Mum. And there he is below. That's Edward Everett Horton. Anybody seen Top Hat? If you haven't, as soon as this is over, go and watch it. He was a very well-known actor in the 30s. I don't know whether this is a dinner or it's a nightclub. Harry was a great what we'd now call a networker, and knew how to work a room. He was always at the Brown Derby. he was at the Clover Club, which I should mention briefly, unfortunately, was a sort of undoing of the family. It was up until 1938. It was a nightclub. Alice Faye sang in the band with the band on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles, but there was a gambling club downstairs, which was tolerated until it was shut down. And I'm afraid that's where Harry and Saul spent quite a lot of the money. So things didn't quite work out as they wanted to. But he was very good at that. He was a very big tipper, I was told, but his wife, Grace, watched the bucks, as Lester told me. So he would go around the Brown Derby and leave these lavish tips, and Grace would go around taking the money back. And there is a bit of the house in Bel Air. That's the front door. So you're a long way from a small village in Galicia. And as I say, very grand. And it's now actually owned, I think, by television people. And the inside's been changed, totally, but the outside's kept itself of grandeur. And that's a bit of the inside. You can see that's the dining room with the silver and the grand table. And the downstairs, that's the projection room set up. It looks as if it's an English pub. And that's where they used to watch a movie every night after dinner, which is what people did in Hollywood. And there's slightly side, there's Lester again on the left. He had this great habit of knowing people. When he was in Spain, he became a great friend of Hemingway. Hemingway, when he decided to go to Spain during the Civil War, wrote to Lester to ask him what to wear, what clothes to bring, and he came back with a film called The Spanish Earth, which he showed in Los Angeles. And the idea of showing that to the Hollywood crowd comes up in the novel as well. I based that on that. On his honeymoon, Saul writes to, I should say, they went to Mexico. Saul wrote to Edith to say he's being paid while he's on his honeymoon. Is he doing any work? He didn't do any work, but he did go and meet Trotsky, who wanted to know about Spain. He was fixed up by a newsman, so he spent an afternoon talking to Trotsky. And when they eventually lived in Bel Air, they met this nice man across the street who was walking the dog, and that's Thomas Mann, the novelist, and his wife at a party.
That's the photographs.
Lots of people get into the story.
So very quickly, because we've only got a couple of minutes left, Peter Lantos says, would there have been Hollywood without the Jews?
Probably not. Who knows? Interestingly, when they opened up the Academy of Motion Picture Art and Sciences opened a museum in the old May Company department store where my mother used to go shopping, and there was outrage because there was nothing about the pioneers who were all Jewish. There were lots of other things, and my cousin Sharon, who is a very successful journalist with a Jewish newspaper in San Diego, and is Saul's great-granddaughter, wrote furious articles about this, as others did, and they had to put it right. Probably not. I mean, they were very great, but they, of course, famously made movies about Americana. I mean, other people have written far more academic things than I have, but I mean, a lot was going on in the 30s there. There was that. One of Lester's friends, by the way, the writer friends, was a communist, a member of the Communist Party, so I bring in a communist writer, so other things find their way in the novel.
So, final question. This is from Peter Manson. He says, I was sad to come to the end of the novel. Will there be a sequel or a prequel? Or indeed, will there be another book?
Another book.
David
on
another subject.
Well, I mean, there's my Story of an Old Bailey trial novel, which is sitting in the computer. But beyond that, yes, I have started a sequel. I'm about a quarter of the way through. And I will simply say that it begins where The Chosen City ends.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we'll look forward to that.
Bobby's in New York with the Pearsons.
And if it sees the light of day, we'd be delighted to have you back to tell us all about it. Thank you, David. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
This book is available from all good booksellers.
I'm not sure they're in bookshops, but they're certainly on Amazon and there's the script has a website.
And it's well worth a read. And to say thank you, I'm going to send you one of my books. This is some photographs of Israelis of all different shapes and sizes. Now then, just a few words about our up and coming program before we leave you. Next week we have a real treat. We've got Gillian Friedman, who will be speaking to from her small holding in rural Bedfordshire. Gillian is author of a book called Jews, Milk, Goats. That's probably a title that will be up for the award of most unusual book title, which there is a real competition. We had a winner a few months ago with Is Superman Circumcised? So we do quite like unusual book titles on Milim. Anyway, Jews, Milk, Goats describes how her and her husband live in the countryside while being fully observant Orthodox Jews. Then on the 26th of February, Dr. Ilana Tahan, lead curator of Hebrew and Christian Orient Studies at the British Library, will be with us. This will be her third occasion on Milim, and she'll be speaking about the library's collection of ketubot, Jewish marriage contracts. Into March, we've got Saskia Conan-Snyder speaking about the unique Jewish contribution to the world of diamonds. We have a live event with John Idaho about Esther Simpson and her mission to get scholars out of Nazi Germany. This is a live event which will be held in the building in Leeds, which is named after Esther Simpson. To book for these and for details about other future events, as well as to see recordings of past programs, please visit milim.org.uk, and you can sign up to our newsletter there to make sure you don't miss anything. All of our online events are free, but you are encouraged to make a donation via our website or with the link that will appear in the chat. It remains for me to thank our guest, David Wurtzel. Once again, thank you so much, David. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
And looking forward to seeing you all again soon. Until then, look after yourselves. Bye.